this is the way that the media cover all gaps, right? All inequality of outcome is obvious evidence of inequality of rights, which is obviously not true. That is obviously untrue. Kids within the same family have dramatically different income. Dramatically different income. I have 3 younger sisters. Our incomes are dramatically different across the spectrum. We grew up in exactly the same house. Okay, but the idea from the New York Times and from so many on the left is that if there's inequality of outcome, this evidence is that America's continuing legacy of racism. So, as I mentioned, there's this article in the New York Times that highlights some of the gaps between white and black America in charts. So they show the unemployment rate age 16 years or over, and they show that basically the gap in the unemployment rate between black and white has been fairly consistent since 1960. It actually spiked a bit. The gap seems to have spiked a bit during the 1980s, but it has gone back down now to probably its lowest point. If you look at this chart, it looks like the lowest point in American history. That gap was about 3% up until the pandemic hit, okay, which is a testament, frankly, to President Trump's economy. I mean, that obviously is a thing. But the unemployment rate, so the suggestion here is that if blacks are historically less employed than whites, even after the Civil Rights Act, and that the gap wasn't closed, then nothing must have changed. Or alternatively, a lot of things changed. Alternatively, there were Great Society programs that paid welfare. Alternatively, there were affirmative action programs designed to get people into college of minority races. Alternatively, there's a change in behavior as well. To simply look at the gap in the unemployment rate and then say racism, if all you knew was one factor, right, unemployment and racism, what you would suggest is racism hasn't changed, because this chart doesn't look like it changed all that much in terms of the gap. But obviously, many things changed, including the number of black Americans who are graduating from high school. The answer is 92%. Including the number of black Americans who are going to college. The answer is approximately, 26% now? Go through a 4-year college? So that is a massive difference. Okay, it's a massive difference. By the way, again, there's this chart. It shows share of people 25 years and over who completed 4 years of college or more. And it shows that the gap between white and black has actually risen a little bit since 1960. Not that many people went to college in 1960, period, between white and black. But now, today, 36% of white Americans over 25 completed 4 years of college. 26% of black Americans have completed 4 years of college or more, which is an amazing, amazing statistic, right? Over a quarter of black Americans are completing 4 years of college or more. Now, what you would have to recognize also is that the black dropout rate is a lot higher in college than the white dropout rate in college. Black student college graduation rates remain significantly low. The nationwide college graduation rate for black students stands at 42%. So there are a lot of black students who are going into college and then are not graduating college. And by the way, it's largely, statistically speaking, black men are more likely to drop out of college than black women are. But that does explain part of the gap. So one of the things that has happened is, again, people refuse to look at ancillary factors that might explain continuing gaps. Because the idea is just a very simplistic single factor analysis. If there's a gap, that gap is due to continuing endemic racism. If you look at median household income, you see that there has been a continuing gap between white and black, and that the gap has actually risen in terms of median household income. Now, you might think to yourself, okay, why has the median household income gap risen, given the fact that racial discrimination in employment has been outlawed since the 1960s in both the private and the public sectors, right? In every state in the union. This is what the Civil Rights Act did. It's Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, essentially. Why exactly is that gap still existent? Well, maybe it has something to do with high school dropout rates. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that so many public schools are failing black students, and so many black students are graduating from high school without actually having rudimentary skills and have to go into remedial education even if they go to college. I mean, there are significant gaps in the number of students by race who are going into remedial education once they hit college. Maybe this has to do with the fact that there are so many single moms, right? That changes the median household income. If the mom and dad are living together, the median household income, right, the mom and dad, their combined income is going to be higher. If more people are unmarried, that's 2 separate households now, right? So the household income is lower. In other words, what the New York Times is trying to do with all of this is imply that racism is still the deciding factor in American life. And in fact, they make this absolutely clear in the New York Times piece. They suggest that in many parts of the country, black and white Americans continue to live in very different worlds. This distinctive feature of American inequality is not an accidental development, but rather a result of policy choices. Again, the idea is that historic discrimination is what has caused all of this, which would not really explain why the black middle class was growing faster in the 1950s before the Civil Rights Act than it did after the Civil Rights Act in 1965. Another example, the home ownership rate. So the home ownership rate prior to 1990, right, going all the way back to about 1980, there's a huge gap between white home ownership and black home ownership. Well, as black income has risen, and it has risen dramatically, from 1960 and on. Wouldn't you expect more black home ownership? And yet black home ownership is actually at the lowest levels that it has been since 1990. So what exactly is going on here? You can't really blame redlining for lack of home ownership by black Americans in 2020 at this point. But what you can blame is rising real estate prices and low income, right? That's what you can blame. How about sentenced male prisoners per 100,000 residents of the corresponding group? So the idea here is that black Americans are being discriminated against in the criminal justice system. Okay, so the gap has actually dropped fairly dramatically from what it once was over the past 20 years. But for every 100,000 black males, 2,272 of them will end up sentenced to prison, as opposed to 392 for every 100,000 white males. Is that the result of racism, or is that the result of individuals making...
Being a National Geographic photographer creates an opportunity for me to...
making criminal decisions? Right? The basic notion here that the New York Times is pushing, and this is the notion that the left is pushing, is that all inequality of outcome is due to discrimination, continuing discrimination in the system, which is not correct. It is not factually correct. When we look at the actual rationales for why income has remained low, or why, for example, young black men who are growing up in high-income households are significantly more likely to fall out of the top quintile than young black women, you have to determine whether there are individual decisions that are at play here. Right? You have to remove the confounds. But for the left, it's not necessary to remove the confounds, because the only thing that is important is implying that all of America's institutions are systemically racist, and therefore the onus is on restructuring those institutions so as to achieve equal outcome